Hi, welcome to my Parsha shiur. Today's shiur is sponsored by Aaron and Lillian Fuchs and Jason Fuchs in memory of Lillian's father and Jason's grandfather, Irving Glatter, Yitzchok ben Dov Ber Zichron Livrocha, whose yahrzeit is on the 29th of Nisan. May his neshama have an aliyah. May we all be zoicha to see Techias HaMesim. Vayikra chapter 10 in Parshat Shemini opens with one of the most jarring moments in the entire Torah. A moment that stops us in our tracks and leaves us asking, why? Over and over again. Let me start first by saying the psukim, first in Hebrew and then in the translation. Vayikhu b'nei Aaron, Nadav and Avihu, ish machtosai, vayitnu v'hen eish, v'yosima aleha k'teres, v'yakrivu lifnei Hashem eish zara, asher loi tziva oisam. And Aaron's sons, Nadav and Avihu, each took his fire pan and put fire in it and placed incense upon it. And then they brought before God an alien fire, which he had not commanded them. V'teitze eish milifnei Hashem v'toichel oisam, v'yamusu lifnei Hashem. And a fire came out from before God and consumed them, and they died before God. That's it. That's the whole story. No warning, no second chances. These two bright young leaders in waiting, Nadav and Avihu, sons of the great Aaron Cohen Gadol, nephews of the greatest Jewish leader of all time, Moshe Rabbeinu, obliterated in a heartbeat by a divine fire. What happened here? I mean, what actually happened? The Torah tells us, simply, they brought an Eish Zara, a strange fire, an alien fire that God had not commanded. That's it. That's the reason? It seems almost too vague. Like, really? They brought a strange fire, so they were thunderbolted by God on the spot? Isn't that too harsh? Which is probably why, as we'll see in just a moment, Chazal, our sages, weren't satisfied with just this one explanation. They saw a mystery here, a vacuum in the narrative, and so they tried to fill in the blanks. And let's just say they didn't all agree. We're going to get to that in just a moment. Some have the opinion that it was arrogance. Others say it was halachic overreach. Others blame wine or impatience or ambition. Some even say they were, in their own way, holy martyrs. It's a real mixed bag. But in the meantime, who were Nadav and Avihu? What did they do that was so bad? Or maybe, what did they do that was so necessary? Intriguing, right? Let's look at the sources together and try to figure out what was really going on. Was this a punishment or a purification? Was it a sin or a sacrifice? The first stop on our journey is the Sifra, the halachic midrash on Vayikra, which gives us two explanations that feel like they're coming from two completely different worlds. Here's the first one. Kivan shero es Moshe v'Aaron shoyem mahalchim tchila v'heim boim achrov v'chol Yisrael achrov omar loy Nadav le'Avihu oit shnei zakenim mesim v'anachnu manhigim es hakahal. When Nadav and Avihu saw Moshe and Aaron walking in front of them, and they themselves coming after them, with all of Israel behind them, Nadav said to Avihu, soon these two old men will die and will be the leaders of the people. Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, mi koiver es mi, heim koivrim eschem, v'yiyu heim manhigim es hakol. And God said, who is burying whom? They will bury you, and they will be the ones to lead the nation. Deep breath, right? Because that's a wild medrash. According to this version of what happened, the crime wasn't incense or fire at all. It was ego. It was unbridled ambition. It was their impatience to take over, to assume the mantle of leadership, even while Moshe and Aaron were still alive and well. Their sin wasn't ritual, it was political. It wasn't religious, it was emotional. It wasn't spiritual overreach, it was just pure arrogance. And God wasn't having it. Okay, but just when you think that's the whole story, the Sifra hits you with a totally different idea. One that shifts the scene from behind the scenes, scheming, as it were, to something much more practical. Kivan שראו בני אהרון שקרבו כל הקורבנות ונעשו כל המעשים ולא יורד שכינה לישראל, אמר לו נדב לאביהו, וכי יש אדם שמבשל תבשל בלי אש, מיד נטלו אש זרה והביאו לפני השם. When they saw that all the offerings had been brought, all the procedures completed, and yet the divine presence had not descended onto the Mishkan, Nadav said to Avihu, "What kind of person tries to cook a stew without fire?" Immediately they brought a strange fire before God. Okay, now that's a completely different take. You hear what just happened? This version says they were trying to help. The Mishkan ceremony was going on, and the climactic moment, the Shekhinah descending, just wasn't happening. So Nadav and Avihu, desperate to make it work, thought, okay, what are we missing here? Oh yes, we're missing fire. Let's bring fire. It was an impulsive act, yes, but motivated by a desire to bring down the Shekhinah, to complete the moment. Not arrogance, not ambition, just initiative. But, and this is important, it was initiative in the wrong place, at the wrong time, without permission. Now, the question is, why do we need two such different explanations? I mean, is this a multiple choice situation? Why won't one answer suffice? Hold that thought, because Rashi is about to enter the conversation and he's going to make things even more complicated. Enter Rashi. And, as Rashi often does, he doesn't just weigh in, he piles on. Not one reason, not two versions of the same idea. He gives us two completely separate reasons for why Nadav and Avihu died, and neither one has to do with ambition or fire or impatience. Here's the first one. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Lo ymesu b'nei Aaron ela al yedei shahoru halacha b'fnei Moshe Rabban. Rabbi Eliezer says Aaron's sons died because they issued a halachic ruling in the presence of their teacher Moshe. Oof, that's a tough one. Not because it's complicated, but because it's so anticlimactic. They gave a halachic ruling in front of Moshe Rabbeinu. That's it? That's the crime? And now they are struck down by a bolt of lightning? God defend us all. But yes, according to Rabbi Eliezer, that's exactly the crime. Even if they were right, even if the halacha was correct, you do not paskin in front of your Rebbe. It's a matter of kavod, of respect, of knowing your place. As I said, God defend us all. But just in case you weren't confused enough, Rashi gives us another possibility. This one from Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel Omer, Shtuye yayin nichnasu lemikdosh. They entered the Mishkan while intoxicated with wine. Yep, you heard that one right. According to this opinion, Nadav and Avihu were drunk, inebriated, alcoholics. They were literally under the influence when they brought the ketores. And how do we know this? Because right after the story of their deaths, the Torah says, don't enter the mikdash after drinking wine. It's like a post-mortem PSA. Careful guys, by the way, don't do what they did. So now we've got four possibilities. Number one, ego. Number two, impatience. Number three, halachic arrogance. Number four, drunkenness. And that's just from two sources. But hang on. Why do we need all these reasons? Why can't we just stick with the original explanation in the Pasuk? Eish zara asher lo yitziva oisam. They brought unauthorized fire. Simple. Done. Or maybe it's not that simple. And maybe that's the point. Let's hear what the Tzedel HaDorech and Sifsei Chachomim have to say about this exact question, because they're both bothered by it too. Why do Chazal feel the need to come up with so many different reasons? Why not just take the Torah at face value? Okay, so let's talk about the elephant in the room. We've just heard four separate explanations for why Nadav and Avihu died. And that's not even the full list. We're only halfway through the source sheet. But the obvious question is, why do we need all of this? What is it all about? I mean, the Pasuk told us why they died. It said they brought a strange fire that God had not commanded. End of story. Case closed. So what are Chazal doing here? Enter the Tzedel HaDorech, a classic commentator on Rashi, who asks this head-on. Kol ha-mefarshim koshu, lama hutzruchu Chazal, lo seis tam v'siba lemisosam. Ze omer kach, v'ze omer kach, haloi b'mikra omar behedya hatam, b'hakrivam eish zora. Translation: all the commentators ask, why did the sages have to give all these explanations? One says this, one says that. The Torah already said the reason. Clearly, they brought a strange fire. Like, what's wrong with the Torah's own explanation? But that's where the Sifsei Chachomim, another commentary on Rashi, steps in. And he drops a very subtle but very powerful point. He says, the phrase Bakrivam Eish Zara isn't actually the reason they died. The real reason is the phrase that follows, Asher lo tziva osam, which God had not commanded them. Let me say that again. The strange fire, the Eish Zara, wasn't the sin. It's just background. The problem wasn't that they brought a fire God didn't ask for. The problem was that they did it on their own, without being told, without permission, without authorization. In other words, their sin wasn't necessarily the action, it was the attitude behind it. And that's why Chazal feel compelled to dig deeper, because the Torah doesn't give us the whole story. It gives us the symptom, but not the diagnosis. The Sifsei Chachomim says it out loud. This phrase, Asher lo tziva osam, is telling us something deeper. It's not saying the fire was the cause of death. It's saying they acted on their own. They freelanced. They improvised. And that's what opened the door for Chazal to say, okay, let's talk about what might have been really going on inside them, inside their heads. So whether it was ego or wine or halachic audacity, the common denominator is they acted without being told. And in the Mishkan, on that day, in that place, that wasn't just a bad call, it was fatal. But before we assume the case is closed, there's a twist, because the Gemara in Eruvin has something to say, and it seems to agree with Rabbi Eliezer that their fatal error was halachic independence. But then the Maharsha and the Torah Tmima show up, and they're not so sure. Let's take a look. The Gemara in Eruvin Daf Samach Gimel Amud Aleph brings us back to the idea that started with Rashi, that Nadav and Avihu ruled on a halacha in front of Moshe Rabbeinu, and that's what did them in. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Lo ymesu b'nei Aaron ad shahoru halacha b'fnei Moshe Rabban. Mai dorshu, v'nosnu b'nei Aaron hakohen eish al hamizbeach. Omru, af al pi shaha'eish yoredes min hashamayim, mitzvah lahavi min ha'hedyot. Translation: Rabbi Eliezer says they didn't die until they issued a halachic ruling in the presence of Moshe, their teacher. What was their reasoning? They looked at the pasuk that says, the sons of Aaron the priest shall place fire upon the altar, and concluded, even though fire comes down from heaven, it's still a mitzvah for us to bring fire from below. Okay, now let's pause here, because based on that pasuk, they actually seem to be right. That's literally what the Torah says, bring fire. So what's the problem? And now that's exactly what Maharsha wants to know. He says, hold on, if that's what the Torah says, that the Kohanim are supposed to bring the fire, then how is that Horas Halacha B'fnei Rabbi? That's not chutzpah, that's just quoting a pasuk. What exactly did they do wrong? And here comes the Maharsha's answer, and it's brilliant. He says, yes, the content of what they said was right, but that's not the point. The point is, they ruled on an issue that involved fire from heaven, while fire from heaven was literally part of the miracle happening at that very moment. The Mishkan was in the middle of opening day. This was the key day. Fire from above was going to come down as a sign of divine approval. But instead of waiting, they jumped in with their own fire, based on their own understanding of halacha, of the posuk. And that, says Maharsha, was the real problem. Not the fire, not the posuk. It was that they inserted themselves into a moment that wasn't theirs. They tried to be part of the miracle when their job was to stand back and let it happen. Still, it's a bit abstract, right? So now the Torah T'mima steps in and he's not content to leave it there. He says, wait a minute, let's say they were right, that the Kohanim are supposed to bring fire from below. And let's say it was a real halachic ruling. Even so, why does that get them killed? And the Torah T'mima says something that really reframes it all. He says, maybe they weren't right at all. Maybe they misapplied the halacha. You see, the mitzvah to bring fire from a regular source, min ha'hedyot, applies only to the outer altar, the mizbeach ha'chitzon. But what did Nadav and Avihu do? They brought fire to the inner altar. That's not just a mistake, that's a category error. And even if they didn't know better, even if it was just a well-meaning mistake, they still should not have ruled on it in front of Moshe. Because, and this is the Torah T'mima's real zinger, even if you're right, you don't get to act like you're in charge. Even if you're quoting Torah, even if you are sincere, you don't paskin in front of your teacher. You don't take initiative in the Mishkan unless you've been told to do that. You don't improvise holiness. And by the way, this is sobering stuff. So now we've seen, maybe they were too ambitious, maybe they were too impatient, maybe they were drunk, maybe they were halachic innovators, maybe they were even a little reckless with technical details. But is that all there is? Because just when you think we've exhausted all the critical perspectives, here comes Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch with something very different. He doesn't look at their mistake, he looks at their motivation. And he says, maybe it wasn't a sin at all, maybe it was something else entirely. So after all this back and forth, were they arrogant? Were they drunk? Were they halachically out of line? Says Rav Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, and he brings something totally different to the table. He doesn't look at what they did, he looks at why they did it. Here's what he says. There's no doubt that their intentions were good. Their hearts were in the right place. But, and here comes the gut punch, in the very moment when the entire nation was being drawn close to Hashem, Nadav and Avihu felt the need to bring their own korban, their own private expression. In other words, they couldn't just be part of the collective. They had to make it about themselves. And that, says Rav Hirsch, is the problem. He goes on to say that Kohanim, priests, don't get to have their own lane. They don't get to be special inside the special. Their whole role is to be representatives, to act only on behalf of the nation. They don't have personal religious agendas. They don't get to freelance a moment of spiritual intensity just because they feel moved and they're there in the spot. Rav Hirsch says that's not the job. The role of a Kohen is bittul, self-effacement, humility. You don't stand in front of the nation and say, I feel something extra today, so I'm going to do something extra. No, you do what's commanded. You follow the protocol. You serve the people, not yourself. So Nadav and Avihu, says Rav Hirsch, made it about them. Maybe not on purpose, maybe not out of rebellion, but still, that's what happened. They felt something powerful. They acted on it, but they weren't supposed to. And in that moment, in that once in history moment of the Shekhinah's arrival, even a little misstep, even a little misplaced enthusiasm could cost everything. So were they evil? No. Were they egotistical? Not necessarily. They were idealists, spiritual strivers, holy men, but they stepped out of line, and the price was death. Still, that's not where the story ends, because the Torah T'mima has one more take, and this one is the most mystifying yet. He says, actually, maybe they didn't die because of their sins. Maybe they died because God needed them to. Yep, just when you thought we had the whole story, they sinned, they got punished, case closed, the Torah Tamima steps in and says, not so fast. He points us to something Moshe says to Aaron right after the tragedy. Hu asher diber Hashem lemor, bikroivai hekodesh, ve'al pnei kol ha'am ekoved. This is what Hashem said. Through those who are close to me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified. And then the Torah adds, Vayidoim Aaron. Aaron was silent. Now this phrase, Bikrovai Ekodesh, it's a cryptic one. Through those who are close to me, I will be sanctified. What does that even mean? Chazal say this was a prophecy from back in Parshat Tetzaveh, when Hashem told Moshe, V'nikdash b'kavoidi, that the Mishkan would be sanctified through my glory. And the Midrash, and the Torah Tamima quotes this, says, don't read it b'kavoidi, through my glory, read it b'mechubadai, through my honored ones. And guess what? Moshe had known all along someone was going to die on Inauguration Day. Someone great, someone holy, someone close to Hashem, but he didn't know who. And now, after Nadav and Avihu die, he turns to Aaron and he says, it's them, your sons. They were the ones. And here's the kicker. The Torah Tamima says, if that's true, then their death wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about failure. It was about Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name in the holiest, most devastating way possible. He even says, yes, they made mistakes, halachic mistakes, emotional mistakes, but that's not what killed them. What killed them was that Hashem needed to make a statement, that this Mishkan, this divine presence among the people, this wasn't going to be a free-for-all. It came with rules, boundaries, and critically, consequences. And so Hashem chose the most holy, the most beloved, the ones with the most potential, and made them the object lesson. And that explains something else that bothered the Torah Tamima. Why did this happen during the Shivas Yemei HaMiluim, the 7 days of joy and celebration when the Mishkan was inaugurated? Why ruin such a happy moment? He says, exactly because it was a moment of joy, because the message had to hit hard. If even the most righteous can fall in the holiest moment, then you, yes you, better be careful. Don't think the Mishkan or the Korbanos or the incense is some magic get-out-of-jail-free card. Holiness doesn't excuse arrogance or error or ego. The Torah Tamima says it straight. The message that fateful day was for the people. The death was a teaching moment, not for Nadav and Avihu, but for everyone else. And that changes everything, because suddenly Nadav and Avihu are no longer just examples of failure. They're something else. They're sacrifices, not korbanos of incense, but korbanos of consequence. Moshe sees it. Aaron accepts it, Vayidom Aaron. And the Torah Tamima says that's why the fire that came down didn't just destroy, it actually sanctified. So now, let's go back to where we started. Was this a punishment, or was it a purification? Was it a sin, or was it a sacrifice? Maybe, just maybe, it was both. In the end, Nadav and Avihu remain a mystery. Were they overzealous idealists, tragic examples of spiritual recklessness, victims of divine precision, or martyrs chosen to sanctify God's name in a moment that would shape all future worship? Maybe they were all of the above. What's clear is this: the Mishkan, and later the Beis HaMikdash, was not a playground for personal expression. It was a space of exacting holiness, of boundaries, of humility. And maybe the story of Nadav and Avihu endures not because it's simple, but because it isn't simple, because it forces us to ask hard questions about service, about sincerity, and about submission. And maybe, just maybe, that's their ultimate legacy. They made us think and tremble and pause before we ever pick up the fire, let me leave you with a story about a Kohen who, unlike Nadav and Avihu, understood how to handle strange fire without getting burned. Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, was a spiritual firebrand, a mystic, a lover of souls, a man who saw divine sparks in everything. People said he could feel holiness in the wind, in the soil of the land, even in the eyes of Jews who had long abandoned Torah and mitzvahs. And that's the key to this story, because in Rav Kook's day, the Jewish world was splitting apart. The old Yishuv and the Zionists, the yeshiva world and the secular pioneers. Torah Jews saw Chiloni Jews, secular revolutionary Jews, as a threat, as people bringing their own fire, unauthorized and uncontrolled, right into the heart of the Jewish people. Eish Zara, right? But Rav Kook didn't see it that way. He didn't dismiss them. He didn't excommunicate them. He saw their fire, wild, undisciplined, sometimes even heretical, and he said, yes, it's kind of a strange fire, but it's still a holy fire, and it's a fire that can be elevated. He would say, the soul of every Jew burns with a holy flame, even if it's hidden under ashes. And his life's mission was to take that fire from the farmers and fighters and poets who had no interest in halacha and in Torah, and lift it up, connect it to the Torah, channel it so it would build the Mishkan instead of desecrate it, so that it wouldn't be an Eish Zara anymore. He didn't allow that fire to replace Torah. He didn't say everything was fine just because people meant well, but he also didn't say, you're out. Instead he said, come in, let me show you how to bring your fire properly. Unlike Nadav and Avihu, who were killed for jumping the fence, Rav Kook's entire project was to open the gates, not by lowering the standard, but by lifting people up to meet it. And maybe that's the lesson. When we see strange fire in our community, people who are passionate, but not yet connected, who want to serve, but don't know how, our job isn't to shut them down, but it's also not to say, do whatever you want. Our job is to do what Rav Kook did, welcome them, guide them, inspire them, and help them turn their fire into something that doesn't consume, but elevates. Because the answer to Eish Zara isn't dismissal, it's education. And that's how you build a Mishkan that lasts. Which brings us to the conclusion of this shiur. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you. Thank you.